Hello, everyone. Mr. Sutherland here. Hope you guys have had a great weekend. Today, what we're going to do is move on to our third method now for solving quadratic equations, and that's going to be solving by square roots. So let me go back real quick to where we are. Um, so far, we have solved by graphing. That's when you guys use calculators to find the x-intercepts, find the places where it was equal to 0. Then we solve by factoring. Now we're building solving by using square roots. And when you're going to use this is when you have just something squared. You don't have an extra x like we have in this one that we factored. Just something squared where square roots are going to help us find the answer. Now, one little fact that is important to us that we need to know for this is that when you take the square root of x squared, it's not just x, it is actually the absolute value of x, which adds an extra layer. And I'll show you how that comes in here in just a moment. So the easiest way to do this is just go through examples. And I'll talk about a little bit how this is different from solving when we were solving by factoring or graphing. If you remember those, and I can go back to our notes here for 9.2a, the key was to solving these is we wanted them equal to 0, right? So that we could factor and use the zero product property. In this one, it's the exact opposite. What we want to do is get whatever squared by itself. So you can see number one, it's ready to go. I have x squared equals 289. So I take the square root of both sides, and we know the square root of x squared, according to this, is absolute value of x. And then the square root of 289 is 17. Now, if you guys remember what absolute value of x means, it means that what number can I take the absolute value of and I get 17? Well, I could take the absolute value of 17 and get 17, but I also could take the absolute value of negative 17 and get 17. So this has two answers. X could be negative 17. Sorry, let me get that eraser to work. X could be negative 17 or x could be positive 17. And then to make that a little shorter, what we do is we use this symbol. Instead of doing this line right here of work, we can jump to the absolute value of x equals 17. That means x is plus or minus 17. There are two answers to this question. And let me show you graphically what's going on here. Here is the graph of x squared. Here is the graph of 289. And you can see that my graph hits that line twice. It hits it once at negative 17, and it hits it again at positive 17. So there are two answers. So problem number 2, the x squared, whatever it is squared, which is right here, is not by itself. So the first thing I want to do is get that by itself. So I add 169 to both sides. That means I have x squared equals 169. Now that I have that thing that's square by itself, I can take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared, absolute value of x. The square root of 169 is 13. And then, well, if absolute value of x equals 13, that means x could be positive or negative 13. So we have plus or minus 13 for that one. All right, why don't you take a moment and try problem 3 on the note sheet. If you printed it, just work it on the sheet. If you didn't, just put this in your notebook. Your first step, again, your hint is you want to get whatever it is squared, which is what I'm boxing here. Get the x squared by itself first. Okay, so let's take a look at how you did this. So we add 16 to both sides, almost like we're solving a linear equation. We have 2x squared equals 4, oh, that should be 50. 2x squared equals 50. Divide both sides by 2. I get x squared equals 25. Now I can take the square root of both sides. So the square root over here is absolute value of x. Square root of 25 is 5. And now if I get absolute value of x equals 5, that means x is plus or minus 5. These almost always will have two answers, positive and negative, when it's just x squared by itself. All right, try number 4. All right, so here is what I'm going to do with number 4 again. I want to get this x squared right here by itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 4 to both sides. So I have 1/2 x squared equals 16. Now, do you guys remember how to get rid of the fraction? If I want to get rid of 1/2, I'm going to actually multiply both sides by 2 because that's the number in the denominator. So I get x squared equals 32. I've got the thing that's square by itself. So now I can take the square root of both sides. So I get absolute value of x equals, now we don't know the square root of 32. So I'm going to just have to write that as square root of 32. Now we're going to use what we learned last section. How do we simplify that? What is that largest perfect square? So I'm going to leave this absolute value of x. We're going to simplify the square root first. If I go back to our notes from last time, what's the largest perfect square that goes into 32? Well, 32 would be right in here. 25 doesn't go into 32, but 16 does. So this is really square root of 16 times square root of 2. So I've got absolute value of x equals 4 root 2. So this is the process from square root of 32 to 4 root 2 is what we did last couple of blocks. Now I've got absolute value of x equals that. So that means x is equal to plus or minus 4 root 2. So there is your answer for number 4. Number 5. Let's take a look at this one. It's slightly different now. Notice this whole thing is squared. So if I want to get that by itself, so I have that thing that is square by itself, I'm going to first divide both sides by 3. And that gives me x plus 2 quantity squared is equal to 6. Now, I'm going to do the square root of both sides. So what happens there? That means, remember, I have the absolute value of x plus 2 equals square root of 6. Square root of 6 cannot be simplified, right? There's no perfect square that goes into 6. So now, when I get rid of the absolute value symbols, I add a plus or minus because it could be plus or minus root 6. And now, to get x by itself, I'm just going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I'm going to do minus 2 minus 2. So I can write this as plus or minus root 6 minus 2. Or negative 2 plus or minus root 6. Either one of those is correct. All right, let's take a look at number 6. So with number 6, here's my thing that is squared. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And that gives me x plus 2 quantity squared is equal to 36. I've got my thing that's square by itself, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. That means I get absolute value of x plus 2 equals the square root of 36 is 6. Well, now get rid of the absolute value bars. When that happens, we know this becomes plus or minus 6. And now I have x equals plus or minus 6 minus 2. And we can actually figure out what that is, right? So if I take positive 6 minus 2, I get x equals 4. If I take negative 6 minus 2, I get x equals negative 8. So I get 4 or negative 8 for that one. Now, when it was the square root, I couldn't do anything. Square root of x 6 minus 2 is just square root of 6 minus 2. But 6 minus 2 is 4. Negative 6 minus 2 is negative 8. All right, now that you've seen those, why don't you try the last row, 7, 8, and 9. Pause the video, work through those three. When you're done, unpause the video, and I will go through them and see how you did. All right, let's take a look here. So for problem 7, here's my thing that is squared. So I'm going to get this by itself. I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I have 3 times x minus 3 squared equals 24. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 3. I have x minus 3 squared equals 8. So now I can take the square root of both sides of my equation. That leaves me with x minus 3 here is equal to square root of 8. We can simplify square root of 8. Square root of 8 is square root of 4 times square root of 2. So I have absolute value of x minus 3 equals 2 root 2. Again, this process here is what we worked on in section 9.3. Now I have x minus 3 equals plus or minus 2 root 2. So when I get rid of the absolute value bars, I do the plus or minus. And now my last step is I am going to add 3 to both sides. So I get plus or minus 2 root 2 plus 3. Number 8. Here is the x plus 8 squared is what's by itself. So I'm going to add 99 to both sides. So I get x plus 8 quantity squared equals 99. Square root of both sides. So this side becomes absolute value of x plus 8. Over here, square root of 99. Well, 99 is 9 times 11. 9 is a perfect square. So this is x plus 8 equals 3 root 11. Now when I get rid of the absolute value, I have x plus 8 equals plus or minus 3 root 11. And now subtract 8 from both sides. So I get x equals plus or minus 3 root 11 minus 8. So what I want you to realize is this is really two different answers. 3 root 11 minus 8 and negative 3 root 11 minus 8. Two different values. Last one. Whatever I'm squaring here is already by itself. So I can go ahead here and jump right to taking the square root. So I have absolute value of y minus 6 equals square root of 24 is 4 times 6. So I've got y minus 6 equals 2 root 6. Get rid of the absolute value, so that becomes plus or minus 2 root 6. Add 6 to both sides, and I get y equals plus or minus 2 root 6 plus 6. So the important thing to realize with every one of these problems that when we're solving using square roots, we are getting two answers every time. The basic ones, we have x squared just by itself, and we're moving everything over to the other side, and you're going to get those two answers. Then when you have things in parentheses, it gets a little more complex, and those are the ones that we'll continue to practice as we move forward with this idea. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email Ms. Musso or myself. And I hope you guys have a great day. I'll talk to you later. Take care.